The way this exhibit got started was it's Women's History Month, and it was Anna Barber's idea that we do an exhibit about some of the women's artworks that we have in the museum. And then when I got your email about these rugs, it was like, oh, can I use this? Because this is something we don't have anything really like this. It would be wonderful. And so it's like, okay, so why do this exhibit? Well, it's Women's History Month. It's another way to look at our collection. You know, I mean, it's like normally you don't think, oh, what do women make, what do men make? You know, it's like what gets made here. But it does, if you look at everything together, there's a certain cohesiveness that you might not see otherwise. And when I started to pull the materials for this collection, you know, the first thing you do is you dive into the database and see what you have. Well, our database isn't categorized as this thing was made by a woman or this thing was made by a man. So it was sort of like, well, what kind of a search am I going to do? It's like, well, I'll search for things where we know the maker, because I decided that there would be no living artists in this exhibit, and we would all have to know the names of the women who made the things. So those are the two things that were necessary for this exhibit. It's like, okay, so the maker field has something in it. And then I just went through, and it's like, that looks like a woman's name, that looks like a woman's name. And so that was really the way I did it. And we have 23,000 records in our database. And so, but for a lot of them, we don't know who made the things. And some of them, you can assume that they were made by women. Much of the textile work. I am sure that a lot of the pieces that we have in our collection that are ancient pieces, you know, could have been made by Wampanoag women, but who's to know? You're never going to know. And so, and one thing, we do have gayhead pottery made by Gladys Wittes and other Wampanoag women, but she's the only one that we know made the particular pieces of pottery, and those are on exhibit downstairs in the One Island Many Stories exhibit. So I did not take them out of that exhibit and put them up here, so I would recommend people go downstairs and take a look at those as well. So that was it's like, well, what are we going to put in? And then the other thing was, we have some new donations and some things that aren't in the collection. Not much that isn't in the collection, but some new pieces, like for example, this sampler has not been on exhibit here in the museum before. The plates that you donated have not been, this is the first time they've been exhibited. And so this is something that is sort of like, let's get some of these things out here, let's show people what they are. And there are so many different ways that we can use these materials. So what happened was, as I was looking at everything that we had, I noticed that they kind of all fell into one of three groups. There were the domestic pieces, the pieces that were made because the family, this is what women did in the home. And that's kind of this section. They weren't necessarily meant to be, they were for show. For example, the samplers, they went on the wall. This is a beautiful piece that, was for, people were meant to see it, but it wasn't like, I'm selling these things, I'm gonna make myself some money, So it was, these pieces are, for example, the samplers, each one of those stitches is something that would have been used in everyday life. For example, if you look at some of these and then you compare it to this blanket here, you can see there's a cross stitch, and this is something that somebody would have, learned how to do as a child, probably as a girl. These were, this is kind of a stretch to say this is women's work, because these were both children who made these girls, 12 years old approximately, for both of them, which is the typical time for a sampler like that to be made. And so, but it was important. Another cool thing about these pieces is that they're both made by girls who lived in Holmes Hall. We don't know what the school or the teacher in Holmes Hall was around that time. One of them was made, I believe, in 1819, and the other was 1823. But if you look at the style of those samplers, I think it's pretty clear that those girls had the same teacher. You know, the borders are the same, the letters are the same, and so this is more research that needs to be done. It's kind of exciting. It's like, okay, what's that going to be? And so, so that's a lot of fun. It sort of brings out these stories that we don't necessarily know yet. And then there's this piece, which is from the 1880s, and that was made by two women. It's a crazy quilt. Those things were in fashion in the 1880s. And the interesting thing about this piece is that there was one woman who did the sewing and the placement of the squares. And then another woman actually hand-painted these squares. With, I believe that's in Edgartown.
Yeah.
Yes. And so these are vineyard seats, and then there was some embroidery over some of the probably you know, commercially available bits of fabric, but then they embroidered over the top of them. So that was sort of one section. And so I included this rug here because even though it's relatively recent, it's still that kind of, it wasn't made to bring to market. It was made because somebody did it. When Mary Jackson did it, she was great at what she did. She had a series of things that are beautiful. I've seen them, they're amazing. And you can see this photograph of her with some of her other pieces. In here, there are some different sorts of, this is sort of the everyday kind of things that would have been made after you had mastered some of these skills. For example, here is a blanket that was woven supposedly by Nancy Michael, who was an enslaved woman. And so there's a story there. In fact, I would recommend that people look. It's kind of this in the corner here is something that we in the museum business call granny notes. They are often incorrect. But they're basically somebody several years or decades perhaps after the thing was made. There's a story with this. I don't want people to forget this story, but they don't necessarily know the accurate story. So they write down what they know, they connect it with the object, they stitched it in this case. So what I think we're talking about here is probably an early 19th century blanket that somehow was associated with Nancy Michael, and then sometime in the late 19th century somebody said, I don't want anybody to forget that she made this blanket, and they put this note on it. But there are certain inconsistencies there. And I think that all of us, well, maybe not all of us, but a lot of us had these braided rugs in their house. It was like it's the thrifty New England, saving the wool. It's also a kind of colonial decor thing, and back in the 1970s that became really big. It was also big in the 1870s. It was just a thing. And so we have this rug that just looks very plain, but everybody has one. And then we have this other piece, which is really rare survival. It was made by a Wampanoag woman named Jemima Easton. She died in 1868, I believe, and it's one of those stories. She lived in the Deep Bottom area of West Tisbury. It's one of those stories where you don't know a lot about a person from the documents. The only documents that I could find about her had to do with her asserting property rights, trying to, people were trying to take her property away. It was like that kind of thing, and so there are sort of official Massachusetts documents about her trying to retain her property rights. And then there are other documents when she became old and infirm from her daughter, trying to get some help taking care of her. But obviously that's not the story of her life. And she was able to make pieces like this. And this was sold to Mrs. Henry Whiting, who must have had a first name, but I don't know what it was, because it came to the museum's collection donated by Mrs. Henry Whiting. And she thought well enough to purchase it from Jemima Easton's daughter, Priscilla Freeman, and then donate it to the Dukes County Historical Society, which is now the Martha's Vineyard Museum. So I've never seen a wampanoag basket of this vintage like this, especially when you know the name of the woman who made it. So it's really very exciting that we were able to have this and exhibit it. And then here, this is one of my favorite things that is in this exhibit because it is so exciting. Since I believe the 1940s, shortly after Laura Jernegan Spear, and I think Laura Jernegan doesn't need an introduction. She's the little girl on a whale ship who kept the diary, but she was from Edgartown, and when her husband died, she moved back from Baltimore to Edgartown, and she opened a little tea room in near the church, the Federated Church, and she sold a lot of things. She collected seaweed and pressed it into little booklets and made souvenir booklets and sold the seaweed. She, sold antiques and curios. I'm not exactly sure what curios we're talking about here. And she was a painter. She did watercolors. I don't have any of her watercolors up here, except insofar as these designs for these plates are watercolor. And shortly after she died, we got a donation of these designs for these plates. And then 2 years ago, they were in Bailey Norton's family, and Nancy made them come to the museum, and it was so exciting because it was like, look at this plate, look at this drawing. After 50 years or however long it was, they are together again. And it was so exciting. And
I have more.
Yeah.
I have a ring from Baltimore Art School, and she gave everything to my grandmother, like her whole life. And now when I'm looking at this, they were 2 peas in a pod, because my grandmother had a junk shop in Edgartown.
It's so, that's the thing. All of these things start to, they make the story richer. Every new thing allows you to get a little bit more information about these stories. So this was so exciting. And so that's it. So she basically needed to, she needed to make money. She couldn't just come back and retire to Edgartown. So she had her tea shop, she sold things, she made things, and that's what she did. So the third story in this exhibit is women who were professional artists. And many of them were teachers. In fact, let's see, we have Amelia Watson, and we have Amelia Watson. We have Edna Reindel, Gretchen Van Tassel, Lois Mailou Jones, Stella Waitskin, and let's see, who's over here? Anyway, a bunch of people. We'll go around the corner, we'll see them. But we have this beautiful watercolor work that was made by Amelia Watson. She taught at the Martha's Vineyard Summer Institute, and we have a lot of her watercolors. They're absolutely beautiful, and she was a teacher. She lived in Connecticut, and in the summer she taught at Martha's Vineyard. She also made illustrations for Thoreau's Cape Cod, so you can see an edition of that here. Edna, beautiful. Aren't they? Aren't they? I think we're going to get postcards of some of those.
Nice.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. Edna Reindel did this wonderful painting of Thomas Nevin Jernegan Dexter, an Edgartown fellow, and he was closely associated with the Historical Society back when it was a Historical Society. But he also lived in he went to New York and sort of was in a crowd of artists. He himself was not an artist, but he knew people like Edna Reindel. Paul Cadmus did a beautiful drawing of him that's in our collection. And so this is the piece of hers that we have in our collection. We also have, and you can see it in the panel when you go around the corner, photographs of other things she did when she was here on the vineyard. Beautiful landscapes of Nemsha, and she was here for at least one summer, possibly more, but did some really amazing work while she was here. Here we have photographs. So there's only, I had 2 photographers in the exhibit, but there wasn't enough wall space, so I pared it down to 1. Gretchen Van Tassel, who is Allison's mom. And we have, she studied photography and architecture design at Bennington, worked as a photographer and other things after her graduation, but before her marriage. Did some wonderful photographs of the launch of the old sculptor and Manuel Schwartz Roberts' last catboat, and also a wonderful series of A Day in the Life of the Vineyard Gazette. And so we have the whole series of this launch, which is really exciting. It was actually donated to the museum by the people who owned the boat.
Or Relocation Authority,
WRA. Yeah, which was the government organization that forced the sort of relocation and encampment, if you want to say, of Japanese American citizens during World War II, which was very, I think everybody's got pretty strong opinions on that, but I think that one of the interesting things is that this is, she was a woman, she was working in this field, and many of the photographs that exist of these places were taken by Gretchen Van Tassel, and they're available online. You can see them, and we were looking at them, and they're really fascinating photographs, and a part of American history that, partially because of her, has remained known. And so I think that it's just one of these, stories that you don't necessarily think of as a vineyard story, but because of the people associated with it, it kind of is. And then here we have Lois Mailou Jones, 2 of her amazing Haitian paintings, and she had a lifelong connection with Martha's Vineyard, did many Martha's Vineyard paintings. We don't happen to have any in the collection, which is kind of strange, but we do have these wonderful collections of wonderful paintings that she made in Haiti. We also have, and thanks to Lindsay for decades ago, 27 years ago or something, doing an interview with Lois that allows us to stand in this exhibit and hear her voice talking about these things. And it's just one of those things that I think that you're not going to find in a lot of other places. The ability to make these connections, pull these things together and say, why is this, why is this here? Why is this important? Well, here is why. She got her artistic start here on Martha's Vineyard, and thanks to Lindsay, we are able to share that with you. If you come around the corner here, I have a piece of hers called Vanity, and Enid Yandel, who sometimes I'll say Edna Reindel, and they say, no, you mean Enid Yandel, and I'm like, no, I mean Edna Reindel. But she was a very well-known sculptor, did things for the Chicago Exposition in 1893. Yeah, and then she was from Kentucky. She did a statue of Pallas Athena, which is no longer associated with the the Parthenon in Nashville or whatever they've got right now. But she's here standing next to it, which I think is pretty impressive. We just have small things of hers, but you know, one of those people who should be better known, sort of out of the classical mold, that she did work with Rodin to a certain extent. She studied in Paris, and so we kind of have the two different styles here right next to each other. And then finally, and everybody who's here had a really strong Martha's Vineyard connection. You can probably catch some of it if you read the labels. I'm not going to go into detail about each one, but it's sort of like, I came here during the summer, I loved it here, this place is part of me, and it kind of will permeate their work in one way or another. And then finally, we have the magnificent bronze arch, which is borrowed. But I just had this wonderful, this is by Ella Tulin, I just had this idea that wouldn't it be great if we could use the building to exhibit some art, and a sculpture that can live outdoors would be perfect for the balcony. There's a window here, and so there she is in all of her glory. So that's sort of the end of it. I hope you'll take some time to go through and look at the things in more detail. This exhibit's going to be up for a while, so at the beginning of June, so you'll have some time. And I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.